Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Writers Education Committee's evening webinar called Hard Target, Shifting the Narrative on Guns in TV and Film while Protecting the Creative Process. My name is Brian Gary. I am the co-chair of the Writers Education Committee, along with Hilliard Guest and our vice chair, Cynthia Riddle. Before I hand it over to this evening's host and also Writers Education Committee member, Ken LaZebnik, I just want to say again, thank you for everyone attending this evening, and also letting you know this will be our last event for this year, for 2022. And as of the beginning of 2023, the Education Committee is going to pause both our in-person meetings and any events so that we can make sure that all of the internal guild resources are marshaled towards the upcoming MBA negotiation. So keep looking at the calendar in the first quarter of next year, and you'll see when first our meetings will start back up and also our events. And if you haven't done so already, make sure that you are connected with your television show captain if you're on a show right now, or if you're not, you can connect to the Guild information system through one of the feature film captains kind of at large. And if you don't know what anything I just said means, make sure you reach out to the Guild and they can connect you with the captain system, because that will be your first line of information for anything going forward into next year. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Ken, and Ken, take it away.
Thank you so much, Brian. I want to acknowledge the members of the subcommittee who made this evening possible: Maria Elena Rodriguez, Justine Gunn, Brian Gary, Jeff Melvoin, and our incredible Writers Guild staff member, Greg Mitchell. So thanks so much for being here, everyone. And here's how this evening is going to unfold. I'm going to introduce our terrific panel, say a few words to give some context to our discussion, and then Kris Brown, president of the Brady organization, will offer a short overview of the history of gun violence in America and where we are now. Then we'll have our discussion with our panelists. And after about 45 minutes of that conversation, we welcome questions from the audience. You can submit them on the Q&A feature down there at the bottom of the screen. So let's meet our panelists. Longer bios of these terrific people are in the program link, but let's welcome Brian Anthony, who is co-EP of Kung Fu. He's been a writer-producer on FBI, Station 19. He's a West Point alum, former Green Beret and Army Ranger with multiple deployments in war zones. Welcome, Brian. Nice to have you here. Don Prestwich and Nicole Yorkin have been one of television's most successful creative teams. They were co-creators and showrunners of Hit and Run, Z, The Beginning of Everything. They wrote and produced For the Killing, among many other programs. And Nicole is a member of our Writers Guild board. Welcome, both of you. David Shanks, the executive producer of 61st Street, was an infantry officer with the 82nd Airborne Division and an Army Ranger before becoming a Chicago police officer and then starting his writing career. He's written for Shades of Blue, Shots Fired, and 7 Seconds. Welcome, David.
Hey guys.
And Kris Brown is the president of the Brady Center, where she's helped shape the conversation on gun violence as a national healthcare crisis. Welcome, Kris. Juano Queen is senior vice president of Paramount Pictures. He's also served on 2 Brady regional leadership councils, first in New York, while he was senior vice president of distribution at AMC, and now in Los Angeles. And I'd also like to acknowledge Robert Disney, longtime staffer at the Writers Guild, who's been invaluable in helping to shape this discussion. For over a century, Hollywood and guns have had a symbiotic relationship. Audience gasped way back in 1904 when they saw a gun shot directly at the camera in The Great Train Robbery. The Warner Brothers dramas of the 30s and 40s featured gangsters and private eyes wielding revolvers that excited audiences with crime and with justice. In 1971, when Dirty Harry said, from a script written by Harry and Rita Fink, "This is a .44 Magnum, the most powerful handgun in the world," the sales of the Smith & Wesson Model 29 .44 Magnum revolver skyrocketed, as art has reflected life and vice versa. real-time deaths by gun violence have been mirrored by violence on cable and streaming services. How many act breaks feature guns? This education committee's mission is to provide our fellow members with craft and inspiration. And today we hope to offer information, resources, and creative suggestions for writers who are crafting stories that involve guns and gun violence. TV and screenwriters did not cause America's epidemic of gun violence, but we are the ones who can perhaps depict new models of responsible gun ownership, as well as the consequences of reckless gun use. So why do we refer to this as an epidemic? It's touched all of our lives. It's touched my wife's life, rippling for 50 years with after effects through her family. As reported in the Everytown White Paper shooting straight, on average, 110 people are killed by guns every day in the United States. And now I'd like to invite Kris Brown, the president of the Brady organization, to enlarge on that context. Kris, if you could take the stage now, thanks.
Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I'm Kris Brown. As Ken said, I'm the president of Brady, the nation's oldest gun violence prevention organization in America today, of course, founded by Jim and Sarah Brady, committed to ending what is an epidemic of gun violence. We lose more than 40,000 Americans a year to gun violence in this country, and it has become the #1 killer of Americans 19 years old and younger in this country, surpassing automobile accidents for the first time in 2020 and continuing to today. So we know what an important and critical role storytelling has in how we think about gun violence. And that's why I'm so very grateful to all of you for being here, to Greg Mitchell, and really helping to make this panel a reality. It's so very important. You able to share your slides here, Disney? Very good. Okay. Next slide. So I wanted to spend just a couple of minutes, and really the meat and potatoes of this is the discussion with the other incredible panelists, but just kind of table setting about the role of guns in America today. Obviously, you know, Brady has been around for a long time. Actually, next year we will celebrate our 50-year anniversary. Founded, of course, by Jim and Sarah Brady, because of the shooting of Jim Brady himself, obviously, when he was serving as press secretary of Ronald Reagan, when Jim and Sarah really tried to scratch the surface of how is it that John Hinckley got the gun that was used to shoot, attempt to assassinate President Ronald Reagan, to shoot him, to kill Secret Service officers. They were appalled to find that the 1968 Gun Control Act, which was intended to ensure that background checks were conducted before any gun was sold in the United States, was never mechanized. In other words, all of the gun dealers in this country that were conducting these background checks had no means to actually immediately check whether someone was a prohibited purchaser or not. If that had been enabled to happen instantly, which is really what the Brady background check set up, then John Hinckley would have been in the system as a prohibited purchaser. So they set about doing something that, while they're among my greatest heroes, I worked on Capitol Hill when that law went into effect. I can tell you they did not think that it would take so long, because all that they were really doing, as I said, was mechanizing this 1968 Gun Control Act. It took a while. It took 6 years, and 7 votes in Congress to enact the Brady Law. Now, when it was finally enacted, it was enacted by unanimous consent in the Senate. That means not a single senator voted against that law. So it's a pretty amazing legacy and history there. The reason it took so long to finally enact that law was because the National Rifle Association fought them tooth and nail every step of the way against a law that in the latest polls show more than 94% of Americans support expanded Brady background checks. And actually, that's the legacy and heritage of our country from the very, very beginning of the foundations of our country. In fact, if you go back to colonial times, before we had a Second Amendment in this country, what you would find is a number of regulations across the colonies that had to do with how you stored guns, that allowed random inspections about where the guns were stored, and that prohibited public carrying of weapons in most places. In fact, just to give an interesting analogy to take away here, we all hear and are schooled in this notion of the Wild West in America, right? We're raised with this image, a lot of times from the movies and the TV shows that we saw, that in any Western town, there were gunslingers everywhere, lurking at every potential corner. But in fact, in most of those towns, you had to actually check your firearm at the borders of the town. You couldn't carry the firearms into public places, and least of all into saloons and places like that. So actually, regulation of firearms and the kinds of regulations that we have helped get passed in many states, including states like California, are every bit a critical component of the heritage in our country. And so that legacy and that understanding of the importance of regulations around firearms really does need to be told, because that's the accurate history of our country. And they work. These laws work. They work to save lives. And so really that's the legacy that we're carrying forward in Brady today, obviously continuing to pass laws, but beyond that, also helping to shape public perception of the role of these laws in our country, of the role and the need to ensure enforcement of these laws, and the role of safe storage in saving lives across this country. Next slide, Robert. So what we're working on in this effort is to build a campaign to help storytellers, to help folks in this industry build off the enormous potential that we know exists to shape public perception of issues that have major consequences in this country. And all of you, I don't have to tell you, already know that there is a tremendous history of doing this in incredible ways to solve really public health issues. And that's what gun violence is in America today. So we've given an example of many of those areas where Hollywood, where storytellers have made such an incredible difference. And really on the issue of guns, there's so many different ways that we can come together in community to show our safety. And this is the campaign that we've built, that we're building together. We've seen that happen, obviously, in the issue of seatbelts. I grew up with the Brady Bunch. It's part of the reason that my father started wearing a seatbelt, is I saw the episodes that were on TV and started hectoring my own father to start wearing a seatbelt, which was a major component of why that story was told then. And actually NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Association, and a number of other groups have coined the Brady Bunch effect, from the huge number of adults hectored by kids like me who changed their behavior and started wearing seatbelts as a result of the inclusion of that message on the Brady Bunch. And a number of other issues like that have been covered and have been collectively addressed through television and movies in a similar kind of way. That's what we're trying to do here. And I want to thank folks like Matt Nix. We sat down and met with him because we know that there's a huge opportunity here to tell the stories that are out there differently and to incorporate the issue of gun safety into those kinds of messages. We're seeing that in a number of different domains. And I think there's a huge potential not only to talk about the importance of safe storage as part of developing a storyline and make it consistent with the character, but also show the perils of lack of safe storage and what happens when you have easy accessibility to guns in homes across America. Next slide, Robert. So what's our ask here, and what are we hoping to talk about today? One of the things is we would like to make sure that when you're thinking about telling stories, when you're thinking about the shows that you're working with and thinking about how to incorporate the issue of gun violence or gun safety as part of the storyline, have at least one pre-production conversation about the role of guns in the story. How can that drive development of character? Because we don't think that things have to be mutually exclusive. And how can that actually leave people with a better understanding of the basic things that they can be doing to protect their families from gun violence, and also to help talk to other people about the role of guns in our society. I want to pause there for just 1 second to give a sense of what I mean by that. When I talk about gun violence as a public health epidemic, as I noted when I first started speaking, it's because we're losing 40,000 Americans a year to gun violence. In fact, in the last year, actually, the number's more like 45,000 Americans. That's not including the about 80,000 additional Americans who are shot every single day, every single year, and survive. So we do lose about 100 Americans a day to gun violence, 100 Americans a day, but 200 more are shot and survive. If you look at that whole panoply of Americans killed and injured by gun violence, about 65% of those are suicide, somewhere around 30% are homicide, and we have unintentional injury of kids with guns in the home. It's a smaller percentage, but 9 kids a day are killed or injured with guns in the home. So if you think about that breakdown, a huge percentage of gun violence can be ended in this country if we think about putting a message out about why safe storage is so absolutely critical and is necessary to save lives. Because if you have a loaded and accessible gun in the home, you are 500 times more likely to experience a suicide in that home. If you have a loaded and accessible gun in the home, you have a substantially increased risk of having children killed or injured in your home. And so the second thing we want is to model safer gun use and creatively show the consequences of reckless gun use and help educate people about this risk, because people are not thinking about it as the true risk that it is. And then the third ask is, whenever possible, limit scenes involving children and firearms. We really want to drive home what a risk this is, and that having a firearm in the home is a choice you can make, but that ultimately that choice has to be matched with safe storage if you truly want to protect your family. I think we have a clip to play here, Robert.
Hey, good morning, Amy. What we see on TV and in the movies can influence us all. Cultural attitudes have been shaped towards smoking, wearing seatbelts, and marriage equality by Hollywood. Now, an A-list cast, people responsible for creating that content say it's time for the industry to take action on gun safety. This morning, there's major star power behind an effort to rewrite the script on how guns are used in Hollywood. Over 200 top actors, writers, producers, and directors signing an open letter pledging to be mindful of on-screen gun violence and model gun safety best practices, encouraging their colleagues to join them. Backed by the Brady Gun Violence Organization, Jimmy Kimmel, Amy Schumer, Shonda Rhimes, and J.J. Abrams are among the big names enraged by the recent mass shootings, who say something needs to be done.
This is not a stop using guns in your movies. This is about gun safety, showing ways to model better gun safety in the future.
The letter asking productions to have at least one discussion before filming begins regarding the way guns will be portrayed and to consider alternatives that could be used without sacrificing narrative integrity. When guns are involved, whenever possible, they pledge to show responsible gun ownership, like characters locking their guns, consequences for reckless gun use, and limit scenes including children and guns.
This is the first sign that there is some acknowledgement that this industry does need to come to grips with. Does it go to the cheap and easy solution of gunplay too quickly?
These creatives recognizing their influence in this moment, writing stories have the power to affect change. Just as in 1989, when the film industry cracked down on romanticizing smoking after legislation aimed to reduce cigarette advertising to children. But the CDC reports the decline in smoking scenes has slowed in the past decade.
Those initiatives are credited with spreading anti-smoking campaigns and things that have saved millions of lives. So this could be the germ of a significant effort.
And this pledge acknowledges that they're under no illusions that their suggestions are a substitute for common sense gun legislation, and their list does not incorporate every nuance of guns on screen, but they say these are small things they can do as a community to impact the gun violence epidemic. George.
And we can hope they'll make a difference.
Thanks so much, Robert. So that really has taken off. That program that Robert Disney, together with leaders in our Southern California Regional Leadership Council. You saw Christy Callahan, she and Juano Queen, who is with us tonight. Hi, Juano. Are co-chairs of our Southern California Regional Leadership Council and have really helped launch this incredible program, Show Your Safety. And we now have, if you want to go to the next slide, Robert, a robust campaign plan and a dedicated group of volunteers in TV and film to help launch this. They've divided themselves into 3 groups. The first group visits writing rooms and offers technical expertise to a variety of projects. Topics include implementing the Show Your Safety principles, on-set safety through our armorers, and really providing the mechanisms and tools and subject matter experts on gun use, gun violence, survivors of gun violence and access to those individuals, law enforcement, and on the policy and political implications. The second group helps to bring the campaign to the studio system, agents and managers, and to the larger industry as a whole. And the third group is incredibly important. That's our academic research group. It's led by professors, by trauma surgeons, and psychologists from Johns Hopkins, from Harvard, and from UCLA. And they help us devise evidence-based approaches to our work to make sure that the resources are there to be able to provide context and detail in telling these stories. So this program, we hope, can really be a critical resource to getting the details right and building strong storylines that develop character, that help educate Americans across this country in the basic facts about gun violence, and also to the extent that we're talking about our heritage and our history and the role of guns, actually set the record correct, because there's a lot of misinformation out there about the role of gun laws in protecting our safety and our heritage of having strong gun laws before the Second Amendment and certainly even after it was enacted. So I just want to thank all of you so much. I hope this has given you a little bit of context for how Brady got involved in this work. And we've got to leave behind with our contact information that Greg will be distributing to all of you. We're always looking for folks who would like to join our campaign and happy to help provide details on a script or a project, or if you just want to learn more.
Great.
I'll turn it back. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kris. Really, really appreciate that information. So now let's turn to our panelists. And I wanted to start our discussion here with David Shanks. And David, prior to serving with the Chicago Police Department, you were an infantry officer with 82nd Airborne Division and an Army Ranger. Then you launched your writing career. And as you started into the industry, what things do you think Hollywood was getting wrong around its narrative about guns?
First of all, Ken, I want to say thank you so much to you and the folks at the Writers Guild for just inviting me out to participate. I think this is going to be extremely beneficial for our membership and folks in the industry, just in general. The things that I believe the industry got wrong that we have a great opportunity, I think, in real time to correct. It's something that's really traumatic. Not to be shot, obviously, yes, but the person who actually fires the bullet is traumatized. And I think that we're quick in the industry because we got the benefit of hair and makeup and special effects and all of this other cool stuff to make a gunshot really neat and contained. But it's really a traumatic thing to witness. And fortunately for me, I was never placed in a position where I had to shoot someone, right? But I've been shot at a lot. And while I was on the police department, I arrived on many scenes where I've seen up close what the damage of small arms fire looks like. And trust me, there is absolutely nothing romantic or sexy about any of it. And it's not just the boom, the bad guy falls to the ground. It's not that at all. It's really traumatizing to see the damage that a 38 caliber slug does to an 11-year-old boy's chest cavity. It's an awful thing that sort of stays with you, and it's something that you'll carry with you, going forward. I've been called to crime scenes where a 2-year-old, has been shot, and people are working feverishly, to keep this baby, alive. Those are things that I will always remember. So I think that one of the things that we get wrong as creatives is that we make the act of someone being shot very, very clean, very, very sterile, and very, very matter of fact, which is why I think, a large portion of our audiences are desensitized to those levels of violence. One of the things that I think that I'd like to add to what Kris and her team have already put into place is I think that there should be a mechanism where creatives get an opportunity to really see exactly what happens to the body when a round impacts flesh, right? To see bones shattered or broken, right? To see the damage that, a hole, what it looks like to see a hole in someone's chest cavity. And I think those kinds of things, in addition to, when we write these scenes, I've watched a lot of television and I've never seen anybody dismantle a gun lock before, they actually had to, use a gun, or police officers taking the pistol locks off of guns before they holster up to go out. I think simple things like that would have much more of a subconscious effect, on our audience members. And then I also think that watching someone go through the trauma of being shot, and I've worked with partners who've had to shoot people, and I've watched them literally shake after they've shot somebody. So it's not something that, you just merely brush off and you get back in the car and then you're on, with the rest of your tour of duty. It's not like that. And really quickly, when I spent time in the military, it was with the 82nd Airborne Division, we were standing on a PT field. We were getting ready to exercise. It was a battalion run that we were getting ready to go on. And there was a soldier who had some mental issues, got his hands on an M16, laid in wait for the entire formation, entire battalion, on this parade field. And he opened fire with an M16 from, a concealed bush. And the confusion and chaos and the carnage that morning of 7 soldiers being shot, while getting ready to exercise, wearing PT shorts and t-shirts. But to see blood in real time, to see bone and muscle torn away in real time is traumatic. And again, I think that, if we as creatives were privy to some of those kinds of powerful visuals, we'd have a greater understanding of what the responsibility is when we put pen to page.
Oh, thank you, David. That's incredibly powerful and thoughtful. Dawn and Nicole, you've written across a range of critically acclaimed series, some of which have dealt with the aftermath of violence. How do you approach crafting a narrative which deals with guns and gun violence? And you'll need to unmute.
I'm so much better muted though. Nicole and I are here, honestly, not as paragons of virtue in terms of figuring out how to deal with this. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, we have contributed a lot to, guns on television with some of the programs that we do. However, to David's point, when we were doing The Killing, Veena Sood, who was a creator, showrunner of that show, insisted every season that we all take our yearly trip down to the LA County morgue. And that was, that was really eye-opening. When you see somebody who has, has been shot in the head and died, and there's just no, there's nothing there, it's like a pancake, you realize the power of guns. And I think, like probably many of us, I too have had, families impacted by gun violence, and that has reverberated throughout, the decades. So I just think that, we're Nicole and I are super invested in figuring out sort of best practices, but I don't know, Nicole, what do you think?
Well, I'll jump in and say, going off of what David said, also, I just happened to watch a show last night that wasn't a particularly great show. It was a British crime drama called, I think, Crossfire. And there was a moment that really struck me because it was a former police officer who has to shoot somebody who's terrorizing a resort or something. And what struck me as being different is that she was really having a hard time not saying, stop, put your hands up. She had one chance to do that, and the guy ran away. She faces him again and ends up shooting this guy and is completely traumatized by it. We see her face, we see her body language, and it made me think, I hardly ever see that. This is kind of what David was mentioning, that when we see somebody shooting somebody else, maybe you'll see the violence on the other side, but you never see what it does to the perpetrator of that violence. And, you know, it was for me sort of a light bulb moment. I thought, you know, we do need to show that. We do need to show the impact on both sides of the equation, because obviously it's everywhere. It's everywhere in our society, and it's not a glamorous thing. And we have to find a way to, you know, deal with it. You know, I mean, the kinds of shows we do aren't always shows where somebody's necessarily pulling the gun out of a gun locker to use it, you know, although we have been on shows that have done that. So, you know, it's something that we're going to have to think a lot more about next time we're doing a show, you know, like your step one of your program, that you have to have a conversation with your staff and with the, you know, your show about how we're going to deal with guns, especially if we're not dealing with, let's say, police officers or law enforcement dealing with guns. Then how are we going to have other people dealing with guns on the show? So thank you. Rambling answer.
Oh, no, that's wonderful. Going to turn to Brian Anthony as someone deeply familiar with guns. You may remember from the introduction, wonderful writer, former West Point alum, former Green Beret and Army Ranger. And when you write a story, Brian, that involves guns, what do you want to make sure that you get right?
Well, I mean, I'm going to echo Dawn, Nicole. Like, I don't think I'm like a paragon of virtue either on this. I think we could all do better on it. One, just to answer your question directly, is like accuracy. I think you want to portray it accurately as much as you can. Owning a gun, the challenges of it. Two, like, I think like one of the other things that like we get pushed into some of the things we're talking about is we're limited by the 52-minute narrative for most of us on the drama. And I think that's what causes us to skip a lot of the things that David was talking about. And for me, it's a constant struggle of trying to balancing that accuracy with the limits of the real estate for most of us, because some of us are on closed-ended shows, and at the end of the day, that's what it is. So that's what it really is for me, is trying to find that balance between accuracy and then servicing the narrative of what you have to do on the page. But I think those are like the two main things that I focus on.
I'm so grateful for your participation tonight, as well as David's. In part, as Brian very well knows, my own son, West Point alum and former Army Ranger, the thing that he always feels strongly about is people who write about guns need to actually know guns. And certainly with David and Brian here, we have that dual aspect of writers who really know guns. Juano, a question for you. This was actually from one of our illustrious committee members, Maria Rodriguez. In this very crowded scripted market, is action or crime-dependent drama dependent on a certain amount of visual gun violence? Is there a risk or reticence, do you think, to produce something in this genre that might be a slow burn to compete with more traditional shows that feature a lot of guns and a lot of shooting?
Thanks for the question, Ken. Before we begin answering it, I just want to say thank you to everyone for having me here, to the Guild, and to the organizers of this panel. And I guess I'll add the disclaimer that I'm participating in my capacity as the co-chair of Brady Southern California Leadership Council. And so, you know, these opinions are my own and aren't necessarily reflective of the Paramount. You know, so as it relates to what's happening in the current marketplace, whether it's for series or feature films or otherwise, I do think that, you know, if you're on the inside of a studio, of a corporation, you're looking at what's done well lately, right? Before you greenlight that next project, before you greenlight that next series, before you greenlight that next film. And if a lot of, you know, I think kind of what's been alluded to here, things like bloodless violence work, right? Whether they work for, you know, a lot of feature films, just sort of that get that PG-13 rating, or a lot of, you know, primetime broadcast dramas that get that, you know, less than the TVMA rating, and you'd go with that, right? However, you know, I do think it is important for us to think about how we can change the narrative. As Kris has alluded to earlier, Hollywood has an incredibly long history of being at the forefront of progressive change, right? Whether that's in relationship to a whole host of issues. And smoking, I think, was referenced earlier. Drunk driving, seatbelts wearing, right? And this can be a new issue where we, as an industry, think less about what's been done before. And of course, right, we all have bills to pay, right? We've all got and so we want to get that next job. However, I do think that we can change that narrative, whether it is through including a scene of someone unlocking their taking the lock off of their firearm, or removing the ammunition from the firearm and storing it separately from the firearm itself, right? Those are things that don't need to take up a ton of space on the screen that I think can be included and I think will work. But yeah, of course, the reality today is that and I'll just pick a feature film franchise. It's not one of Paramount's, the Fast and Furious franchise, right? Those movies work. That's why there have been 9 or 10 of them. And I do think that people have grown accustomed to seeing that kind of fictionalized action hero gun usage portrayed on screen. However, I also think that there is an appetite in our general society for something new and something slightly more real.
Gee, the Fast and Furious movies always seem so real to me. I know, Brian, Gary had this great thought when we were talking about this panel. He said, really what the writers, this is really for the writers, like what opportunities do you feel like we're missing as storytellers when we tell stories around guns? Like, has there ever been, for any of you, like, oh, I would have loved, this speaks to Brian's maybe comment that, well, we have 52 minutes to tell a story and, there are these things we have to accomplish. But what opportunity, has there ever been a story where you thought it would be great to have this story that unfolds in this way, that features a gun and that it's just a missed opportunity?
I think, yeah, I'll go, Ken. Like, I had a couple. Like, first of all, I'll just say, like, you brought up that David and I are here, like, because we've been in law enforcement or the military. But like, I think the first thing writers could do is just educate themselves. You know what I mean? Like Dawn brought up going to the morgue. Like, if you haven't shot a gun, you're writing about guns, go shoot a gun. And I'm not saying do it illegally, do it. Be smart about it. Ask a friend that's experienced. I've been on shows, I'm sure all of us have, that are, there's ex-law enforcement on them. They know the ways around and how, when, where to go responsibly shoot a gun. And if you're at a range anywhere and you're not doing it safely, I guarantee somebody's gonna let you know about it very quickly. I think that's a great way to quickly learn how to do it safely. And then as far as your question, yeah, I've thought a lot about it because I think I've fallen short personally sometimes due to time constraints, the page count, whatever. But I think we need to focus on like finding the movements and finding the moments. Finding the movements kind of alludes to what Juano was bringing up. Like directors, producers, especially actors, always looking for business, right, to do during a scene. Always, they want to do something. They want to be doing a Rubik's Cube. They want to be something with their hands. The gold bar is that they're doing something that also builds character, demonstrates competence, but that goes to all the things. Like there's a lot of banal aspects to gun ownership that you could be doing at the top, bottom, or during the meat of a scene, which is assembly, disassembly, cleaning, storage, inventory. All those activities, while not like terribly dramatic on themselves, those are small subversive ways I think we could all kind of lay in on scenes. And then finding the moments, for me anyways, before I broke in and even moved to LA, I was training people like how to shoot guns, like fire, like weapons. And it wasn't anything big. It was like very simple stuff. And one of my clients was a daughter who bought it for her father. Like it was for Father's Day gift. She wanted to take her dad shooting. So I took him out, I shot him out to shoot. We shot a few rounds. They had a blast. They absolutely loved it. So much so they came back again. And, to me, that story wasn't about the gun. It wasn't about murder. It wasn't about anything else. It was in fact very much about this relationship between a daughter and her father. And I have no idea like what I built my own backstory in my head because I'm a writer, but stuff like that. I have other friends that are hunters. They didn't connect to their dad in any other way than hunting. And again, it wasn't about the gun. It was their sole emotional connection. So I think stuff like that and just pushing ourselves to find those stories that are just beyond just outright violence.
Yeah, can I just interject really quickly? So excellent point about, familiarizing yourself with how guns work. Robert Disney noted that Brady does a day on the range for TV and film professionals. The next one out in LA is on December 9th, and you can RSVP to him, Robert at bowersdisney.com. Robert, if you want to share that maybe for everybody, all the participants. It's going to be managed by Dutch Merrick, a veteran armorer with support from other marksmen and law enforcement. So that's a great opportunity for people in the film industry out there in Los Angeles. And I know, by the way, that the Writers Guild East also has a similar program. They work closely with ATF and enforcement officers out here in New York City. Other opportunities for storytelling that you feel like were left on the table? Anything that comes to mind in the stories you'd like to tell? I thought Brian's point was really well told.
You know what, Ken, what I would really love to see and what I've sort of challenged myself to put together, at some point. I don't want to mix apples and oranges, but a lot of what happens in the inner city, with the proliferation of guns, right, is where do all of these weapons come from? Again, I worked as a cop in Chicago, where at one point we had the most stringent gun laws, in the country. But again, just across the border in Indiana and Michigan and Wisconsin, where the gun laws weren't, as, tight, kids would literally, just drive right across the border, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, you're in a whole nother state, you get whatever you want, you come back, and then there's a market. So there was a pipeline, almost. I always thought it would be interesting to really shed, light, on that. There are no poppy fields on the south and west sides of Chicago, but, there's a lot of crack cocaine, that comes through, those, parts of the city. And then the question becomes, like, how does that happen? And how is it that this is where the concentration, of all of the violence, is? As a cop, I was taught that wherever there's dope, you will find a gun immediately. You can guarantee that. You just have to, look, close enough, and the two go hand in hand. So again, I think, when you start to, kind of tell those stories that peel back the layers of the why and the how, I think you can impact, change and affect change, that way, as well, because you're bringing another level of consciousness, I think, to the audience.
That's great. Yeah, Dawn.
I was just thinking, someone very close to me, might be a member of my family, who lives in Texas, lives on like 90 acres of land, right? And he's got all of these, and there's woods all around and interesting animals and places to explore, and very isolated. But recently someone, like somehow a meth addict ended up on their property, broke into their car, which is unlocked because, they don't expect people to come onto their property. Broke into their car, and they had a gun sitting on one of the seats. And so, of course, among other things, the addict took the weapon, and they realized that there was a stranger and the dogs were barking and all of that. And so they called the cops, and eventually this guy was apprehended somewhere, but he didn't have the gun, and he had dropped the gun somewhere in the woods. So this close person to me has multiple grandchildren. that he likes to have come over, and they can run and play in the woods and explore and do all the things that he wants those woods for those kids, you know, to just really have that kind of experience. And now they can't feel safe that those kids aren't going to find a loaded weapon somewhere in the woods, and it's their weapon that's out there somewhere, this ticking sort of time clock for them, you know. And to me, that's sort of a more interesting version of the power of the weapon, and you know, the danger that it holds, and just how ridiculous it is to have something like that, you know, be available, that it can end up so easily somewhere where small children can find it. So
I trust you're going to write that someday.
In the next hit and run, we'll figure it out.
If I could, it's a question for Juano. Again, Maria Rodriguez was asked, curious about, is a gun on the poster of a show default iconography to distinguish it immediately as part of a saleable genre? I think this is something we all sort of deal with. I notice this all the time. How many posters of shows feature that guy with the gun? You know, the James Bond icon is guns or
yeah. Certainly, I mean, yeah, that's exactly right. That's a great example of a piece of IP that is sold and marketed, promoted using the image of a gun. I do think that there are certain subsets of our population, and it's not exclusive to the United States, but we're focused on the United States here, that find guns attractive on some basic level. They find the prospect of gun violence appealing, or at least the subject of curiosity, right? And I think it also works outside of our industry. So this is not just limited to filmmaking and television. This is also the case perhaps for gaming, for video games, right? You have games like Modern Warfare and Metal Gear Solid, etc., that use that imagery to, or perhaps the worst of all, Grand Theft Auto, use that imagery to promote and ultimately to sell and have consumers, fans engage with those properties. And I definitely think that's true in our industry, whether it's the James Bond, the sort of the iconic credit scene where he's always, the end scene is him shooting that gun, and then the bullet goes through the screen, and then the movie opens up, and that's also true in other contexts. So yeah, that can be used, and I think that's something that we, as a community, my personal opinion, have an obligation to try to diffuse to some extent, because guns are not merely these romanticized things, right? They do cause real damage, as David was talking about earlier, right? And that's something that we need to try to balance as well, right? I mean, they are real, they're in our society, we're not getting rid of them. There is the Second Amendment, and that is something that I believe in, just like I believe in the First Amendment. But at the same time, we need to balance that with the reality. And so I don't think we're going to get rid of guns on movie posters. I don't think we're going to get rid of guns on series key art, right? I just think that we need to try to do our best to balance that at the same time, because there's a reality that I think frequently is glossed over or skipped over.
I want to take this opportunity to remind the audience that you can post questions into the Q&A during our discussion here. I look forward to getting questions from our audience attendees. It's interesting, this Everytown research venture that we referenced in our chat earlier. One of the things they point out is there's this huge preponderance of guns on television, specifically being used for either law enforcement or crime. There's almost never a depiction of guns used recreationally, for hunting. I don't know whether, because I think, Brian, you were saying, you encountered this example of here's hunting, which is a very different situation of gun use. And we just almost never see that certainly on network television. It might offer an opportunity to, show guns in a different light anyway.
No, this is not exactly to that point, but because I'm not a fan of hunting, and I don't know if I'd want to see, or maybe seeing animals being killed, maybe that would discourage some people from, or let people know just, how deadly shooting and guns are. But I was just going to say that I have a friend who loves guns, has a lot of guns, and convinced me recently, or maybe 6 months ago, to go shooting at a range with him. And I'm someone who had studiously avoided ever touching a gun, holding a gun. I wouldn't go skeet shooting with my family because I was against the concept of holding a weapon. And I agreed to do this. And the thing that I felt was, first of all, it was terrifying to actually hold a gun and to see it being loaded as somebody who's never held a gun. And then it was so not sexy. And I'm sure, obviously, if you're somebody like David or Brian, you guys know how to use weapons. But for someone who didn't, it wasn't easy to use. It wasn't easy to shoot. There was kickback. The whole thing was just not at all like the, romanticized, like the way we see it on television. It made me think, we don't see that so much. We do see people picking up, a gun and easily shooting it and hurting someone. And I don't think it's as romantic or glorified or easy as we think it is, And
Nicole, if I can, I just want to kind of piggyback on what you're saying a little bit. It shouldn't be romanticized. And I think what happens a lot of times, particularly, with law enforcement, and even with the criminal, element, it's about, and again, this is just David Shanks. It's, in my opinion, and again, just based on what I've experienced, with working, right, around guns from both sides, the law enforcement and dealing with people that shouldn't have guns, that have guns illegally. It's about an inability to properly use tools for conflict resolution, right? There's a God complex that's associated with the use, of a gun, right? Because at the end of the day, if you are not going to be in agreement or alignment with my point and what it is that I want from you, or if you've disrespected me in some kind of way, at the end of the day, this gun is the ultimate, neutralizer, and it will settle all dispute. And I just think that it's unfortunate that, like we, as a society, have sort of regressed, to that, place. Now, again, I'm speaking from the standpoint, guys, of having seen what guns do to people up close. And it's not sexy at all. There's nothing about it that should be, romanticized. It's definitely not something that should be glossed over. And again, both parties are traumatized. There's a stigma in law enforcement that, if you go and ask for help because you're struggling with an issue or some sort of, trauma or great stress, if you go and seek counseling or therapy, there's a weakness, in you, which in my opinion is utterly ridiculous, right? Shooting somebody is traumatic. You should have to go and talk to somebody to sort of unpack, what all of that is, particularly if this person is now paralyzed from the waist down, from the neck down, or, ultimately this person's life, has been taken, somebody's father or brother or son is not coming home anymore. And that, like I said, is something that, you definitely have to reckon with. I've seen, people that, they try to move on, but you can tell that it's impacted them, you know, in a real way. And again, as storytellers, I think a lot of times we do ourselves a disservice in educating our audience about the effects and the traumatic effects of gun violence when we don't spend a beat or just a little bit of that real estate with that cop and how he's processing what he just did, you know, or, you know, his partner who had to hold his hand and rush him to the hospital because he was shot. You know what I mean? You know, my wife hated the fact that I was a cop because I worked midnights. So anytime the phone rang after 11 o'clock, she panicked. What happened? You know, and, you know, there were a couple of times when my partner had to call the house because we got into something. You know, he's okay. He would always start the, he's okay. He's okay. We had to go over here. This happened, that happened. But, you know, it's traumatic, and the ripple effect of that kind of trauma, you know, reverberates, you know, across the family, the community. And again, I mean, I just think that, you know, we should invest more time and more effort, you know, and more energy, especially as EPs and, you know, with newer writers coming on board, you know, taking some accountability and a little bit more responsibility with how we deal with stories that are centered around guns. Because at the end of the day, I mean, they serve one purpose, right? As a soldier, I'm not taught to shoot people to maim them or knock them down, or why didn't you shoot them in the leg? I'm taught to hit center mass, a nice tight 3-round shot group right here. As a police officer, you are trained to fire and shoot and hit center mass. When you hit center mass, you're going to kill whatever it is that you're shooting at. That's in the military and that's in law enforcement. So again, you know, those are the things that, you know, police officers and military personnel, you know, are trained to do, because that's the intent, that's the end result that you want. So again, you know, it's incumbent upon us to have that responsibility and to take it on, I think.
David, while we're talking about law enforcement, the Shooting Straight white paper tells us that on shows that center on law enforcement officers, about 1 in 3 episodes showed at least one person being shot. And it gave me the question, how often do police officers actually use their guns?
It's funny, right? I know guys that have been 20 years on the job and have never fired their weapon. You know, I was a guy that spent 6 years on the job and never fired my weapon at anybody. I've been shot at a lot, but you know, again, it's a rarity. At least, you know, again, you know, where I worked in the time period in which I worked, that there were officer-involved shootings. That wasn't an everyday occurrence. It was one of those things that when it happened, everything stopped, because now we've really got to unpack what happened. I had an instructor tell me in the academy, he said, listen, when you put that pressure on that trigger, right? That less than 2 pounds of pressure that it takes to pull that trigger, and that bullet discharges from that firearm, you can't call it back. So you better be sure, you better be damn certain, you know, that you are in alignment, because not only is there a life involved on the other end of it, the ripple effect for you, right, could be equally, you know, traumatic, but just in a different way. You know, there are police officers in Chicago being sued, losing their homes, marriages falling apart behind officer-involved, you know, shootings because it was a bad shoot. And now you have to deal with the ramifications, you know, of that. So that's a lot of pressure to put on somebody that has to make a split-second decision about whether they're going to or not, right? So again, I just think that, you know, all of those things that as creatives, you know, we can also sort of take a beat, you know, to sort of unpack that, you know, a little bit. To Brian's point, I get it completely. You know, it's always, hey, can you pull 2 scenes out of this? You know, can we get this down to 43 pages? You know, we're really struggling. You know, can you help us out here? I get it. I completely get it. It's something that I deal with all the time. But also, like I said, I mean, when you're sitting around that table, you know, with 10 really smart people, you know, we can figure it out. You know, we can figure out, you know, how to, you know, do those kinds of things that are subtle, right? But also, you know, move the envelope, you know, a little bit in a direction that I think will benefit the audience in the long run, society in the long run, you know.
I just wanted to point out, make sure people saw what Kris had noted here in our chat, that it goes back to what David was saying about storytelling around the origin of guns. You know, 5% of the gun dealers who don't sell guns legally are responsible for about 90% of the guns recovered at crime scenes. And there's a story in that, you know, contextualizing that, showing why lack of enforcement of the law is driving violence, and that's an important storyline to consider. Now, here's a question that came up again from that Everytown study. So they did a study of a gun safety related storyline from Grey's Anatomy. So that story was about an unintentional shooting in the home involving an improperly stored gun. And then they sort of did this study where they showed this episode to gun owners and to people who were not gun owners. And the gun owners experienced a greater reactance to this storyline. That is to say, they felt they were being manipulated. So here we are talking about trying to integrate these kind of storylines into our writing. How can we, you know, not have that counterproductive effect of making people feel like they're being manipulated, like somehow we're trying to force an idea upon them? I mean, obviously, yeah, Dawn, I see you.
I'm just thinking, you know, we're Hollywood. That's what we do. No, you know, if you can solve that, there's a lot of other issues like that we could deal with, but I think that's just it's what's happening in our country today too. We're so divided and sensitive. And I think that each side has knee-jerk reactions, you know, and that's just, you know, I wanted to add too, just if anyone wants to use the story, you can take it. If any writers want to use this, because Nicole and I don't usually, I don't know why we haven't written stories like this. That gun that my friend had stolen was a ghost gun.
Oh, geez.
And this is not a person that you would think he would have a ghost gun, but he's got an engineer brain and he likes guns. You know, he's just interested in guns. So he did whatever you do. You order it off the internet or you read about, I don't even know how you do it.
You order it from the internet. Yeah.
Right. And then you build your own gun. And so this is a gun he had built just for his own intellectual, you know, entertainment. But so there is that is part of what's out there, is a gun that's completely, you know, unregistered and, you know, untraceable, that's out there in either, hopefully it's just in the yard, but, you know, just being out there in the woods is not necessarily a good place for it either. So
waiting for grandkids to come walking by.
Waiting for grandkids, waiting for little kids, you know, they've got perfect age little kids to start running around, picking up things and going, look what I've got. So anyway, so yeah, I don't know how to answer that question, Ken. I really don't. I mean,
Brady's done a little bit of research on this, because we have a campaign called End Family Fire that is really trying to contextualize why safe storage is so important. We started it in 2018. We had to start with a lot of qualitative and quantitative research with gun owners across the country to make sure that this message that is directed to gun owners would resonate, for the exact reason that is picked up, I think, a bit with the Everytown research. I agree with everything that you're saying, Dawn. I mean, of course, there's going to be some amount of perspective and storytelling. That's how it happens. And you're going to have people react to it. But I think one of the big takeaways from the research consistently, and we do it every year with gun owners across the country, because we're releasing new content all of the time, is this notion that because of the polarization of the issue of firearms in this country, there is an immediate reaction that a lot of people have to any discussion about it. And what many will feel is a judgment. So what I was very surprised to hear, to be honest, is a huge strata, and whether they'd grown up with guns or were more recent gun owners who participated in these groups, saying, when I tell people that I own a firearm, they often react like it's synonymous with me telling them I'm stupid. And I have a problem with that, right? And so we've had to really think about how we talk about the decision to have a firearm in the home without rendering a judgment based on that decision in any way. And the biggest way we have found to do that works with the research is the role of the influencer. Who's the character telling the story? You guys know that way better than I do, but that's why a huge number of folks that we have drawn to End Family Fire are law enforcement and veterans. Because if the folks that in our society, everyone believes really understand the role of firearms are telling these stories, it's received in a way by the audience in a different kind of way than folks that don't have that kind of authority. So there's a lot of research we have on that. Happy to share more details if folks are interested, but I think that's who.
I don't understand what that looks like. What does that mean then? It's what does that look like on the screen? What are they seeing on the screen that's not getting
so these are PSAs, Dawn, so it's not in the it's not in a narrative.
It's not in storytelling, yeah.
Yeah, so the storytelling there is a veteran talking about losing a fellow veteran and the need for safe storage. So it's a different, but I think the research is still applicable to how you would think about what kind of character should be telling those stories.
I mean, I kind of think like too, like when you get these polarizing things, we all have to accept that there's just some people, you're not changing their mind. There's a certain percentage, and we all have to accept that too. And that like, that's fine. That shouldn't affect what we're trying to do. Just because we can't, reach the zero sum of everybody agrees with us, like that's fine. Some people aren't going to agree with that and not do it. And some of the ways we've been talking about doing it are just through action. We don't have characters looking down the pipe and essentially doing a PSA within the episode. I think that's like that's other ways we can do it. Like it's very subtle ways that they're doing it where we can avoid being preachy to people. I think we can do it. Even if we just move the ball down the field a little bit, I think it's worth it. It's well worth it. So yeah, that's just my personal opinion. I think sometimes we can get caught up in stuff like that and numbers and that sort of thing.
Can I offer it up the other way just really quickly, Ken?
Yeah.
Here's my fear. My fear is that it would be romanticized for the 15-year-old boy who has an M16, whose mother drops him off, at a protest, with, this weapon. And then he ends up, shooting 2 or 3 people, and killing somebody, right? That's where I think, we're entering into. So I guess what I'm getting at is that it's also about the stories that we aren't telling, right? And I think that, we shouldn't lean, into those lanes. If there was someone who had a gun in their house, and I'm just assuming, Kris, that this veteran lost a friend who had a gun, in the home, if it was a vet who was suffering from some sort of trauma or PTSD or depression and took his own life, I think that's something drastically different. And it also brings up some other things that we should talk about or that should be in the discussion, the treatment of veterans, once they separate, keep being able to really put a thumb on, our brothers and sisters who are having some problems post-separation, or what have you, because that's a very real thing. And unfortunately, those are the things that happen. But I think there's a difference between that and the gun owner who has a gun in his home, because there's some very bad people out in the world, right? And the second that bad guy, true story, we purchased a home here in the Valley, and a guy climbed up on our, awning or what have you, right? And peeked right into my daughter's bedroom window. She sat up and was terrified. She was so afraid she couldn't even scream, right? The dog went crazy, which woke me up. And by the time I got downstairs, the guy literally was jumping off of the roof and running up the street. When I was a cop in Chicago, I would tell people, listen, or I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to some of the things that we were taught, right? You cannot shoot this man, outside of your home. So if you have to shoot him, when we get here, we want to make sure that he's inside the house. True story. True story. That's what's told and that's what's taught. But the lesson in it is that the gun ownership and the responsibility of the gun owner and using this gun to protect your home, that's what the amendment is for. That's what it's for. It's not for the kid, like I said, to walk down the street with an M16 slung across his back that his parents, got for him. That would fall, I think, squarely into the category of irresponsible gun ownership, right? And again, we aren't telling those stories, and nor should we. That's all I wanted to add, to it.
That's great. Yes, Juan.
Maybe to piggyback a little bit, it's certainly on something that Don said earlier, kind of, I think, in a joking manner, but saying that's kind of what we do in terms of moving the needle of culture. Right. It is something that we do. And I think it's something that typically we've been very proud about in this town. And it's something that I think we should take pride in, because I think it's a good thumb historically that we put on the scale. Not always, right? There's D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. That was a terrible beginning. But we've made progress since then. And, to Kris's point, or, earlier about, this stat of guns in the home and what that leads to in terms of adolescent, juvenile injuries, death, etc. You can tell that to people. You can tell that stat to people, and they will push back on that stat. In the same way that you could say that after seatbelts and drunk driving laws became prevalent throughout the country, fatal car accidents went down, right? That's a stat. And this, if you say that, that's a similar stat about gun violence, people will push back on you. They'll argue against the stat. And so it's like, sometimes you can't, as Brian said, you can't convince everybody, right? Because they're going to argue against numbers. And what can you say? However, we as Hollywood, as filmmakers, as screenwriters, as studio executives, have, I think, a responsibility to hold up that mirror to society and hopefully to change it. But just like I don't always love looking in the mirror, right? It's just the reality. Our society at large sometimes doesn't want to look in the mirror, and yet it is still our obligation, in my opinion, to hold it up. Right. And that's how we move the world forward. We move the society forward as it relates to this particular issue.
Some of that pushback is guilt. It's some of it. Some of that pushback is that, you're right. I agree, with what you're saying, but because of some other issues that, people are dealing with, and some other insecurities that I think, show themselves, through, irresponsible gun ownership, and going back to that God complex we talked about, a little bit earlier. The lack of the proper tools for conflict resolution, those kinds of issues, that pushback, rears its head, in that way, as well. They're just projecting, their stuff, back, on the stats, so.
I think that, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think our, maybe what it is, it's on us as writers and creators to tell stories that are so compelling and use make your gun point in such an organic way so that it's really authentic to the character and the world and the culture that the character's in, so that the audience is almost, they are unaware that a message is actually being brought to them. I think when it feels imposed and directed, I think that, all of their hackles go up, and, it just demands better writing on our part, I guess, to try to make it work, really organically.
Yeah. One last reminder, any questions from the audience, please put them into the Q&A. We only have about 10 minutes left. Don, what you were saying reminded me so strongly when we were first talking about this panel. Jeff Melvoin, raised this very, very legitimate point where he said, this is tricky territory. One of the most powerful movies to him, and I think to many people, is The Godfather. The Godfather, a beautiful movie, a deeply moral movie, but God knows there's a lot of gun violence in The Godfather. And how do you, as a writer, find that? I think maybe Dawn was alluding this, but how do you tread that ground between, the moral position of The Godfather and the violence in The Godfather, and something that, holds the mirror up to society or doesn't, or reflects back on society in a way that's not as authentic or truthful? Anyone? How do you deal with violence, and how do you account then for movies like The Godfather, where it feels like, how else do you tell this story? What else do you do? You don't want to cheat that movie out of its cathartic moment.
But I also think that there's a level of responsibility now coming from a huge fan of The Godfather. I think 2 was better than 1, but again, that's just me. My mother used to say, if you knew better, you would do better, right? And I think now, post Godfather, where we are now as a society, we know better. We know the effects of, the violence and some of the gratuitous, nature. So to your point, Ken, in order to tell that story and to be authentic and true to that story, yes, you had to do that. But I've become a huge fan of, I see the gun, I see the guy that's about to get shot, and then I cut to the long shot out the window looking in, and you just see the muzzle flash. You know what I mean? That I think is equally effective. You know what I mean? But I'm also sort of taking into account, the carnage that we were talking about and the reality of what it is, but the point is still driven home, right? So again, I think now, post Godfather and movies like that, we know better. We know the effects of these video games on young people. We know the levels of violence that, our audience has become desensitized, to. So again, now that we know better, we just have to do better.
Yeah, I mean, I think if part of the appeal of the action thriller violent thing that some of us do is a catharsis, that there's that sort of unconscious catharsis at watching the good guy, kick ass and get the bad guy and wreak havoc on all the people who deserve it, then I think that there's a hell of a lot of ways to be interesting and creative and violent without shooting people. I mean, we had Lior Raz throwing people off roofs and, beating the shit out of them, all over New York City and Tel Aviv. And we didn't have very much gunplay at all in our story. We did have it in a terrible place sometimes too. we were not paragons, but there are a lot of other ways to do violence, I mean, which I don't know if that's the answer either, but you don't have to have a gun in a scene if you need a good guy to get a bad guy. You know,
Or
you
you
really
just, going to what everybody has said is you just have to see, you want it to be realistic in such a way that it really impacts people. Like I would say The Wire, and, did a great job of really conveying, I think, the violence of, Baltimore, in that part of Baltimore, and the horrible effects of, guns and rampant gun use. And so it wasn't glamorized, I don't think, in any way. And we saw all of our favorite people eventually getting killed, and it was horrifying.
It was tragic. And I think maybe that's the answer is, just remember, we're not there to glorify. We're there to sort of elucidate the tragedy of what happens when that gun goes off. Even if it's the good guy getting the bad guy, it's still tragic. Like David is saying, it's tragic it should be tragic on some level for both individuals.
Mm-hmm.
I just think we got to challenge ourselves to tell the whole story, not just the middle. You know what I mean? The before and certainly the after.
Yeah.
And carve out the real estate for that.
One of I'm certainly not at all well equipped to be able to do what you all do, but one of the things I've always thought about is the trope of a good guy with a gun, in part because so many of the people that I end up meeting as part of this work, who are survivors, who've been in active shooting situations. I'm thinking about the Walmart in El Paso, where there are a number of people who had firearms who did not use them. And this is often the case because they were terrified of being mistaken for the shooter or shooting the wrong person. And being able to tell some of that, I think, as part of driving the narrative would be hugely useful, because there's this impression that if you have a gun, you'll be able to use it well, and that it will be a no risk proposition. And of course, you, David, as a former law enforcement officer, know, I mean, it's fascinating to hear that you were shot at a lot, but in 6 years you never fired your firearm.
Never fired my weapon at anybody.
Right.
Yep.
And so that, contextualizing that, I just think that in and of itself can be a huge social value.
Yeah. And Kris, I will go further and say that most cops, like I said, I've known guys 10, 15, 20 years on the job and have never fired their weapon at anybody. They go to the range regularly because you have to train to be ready, when you have to. But that's the last thing you want to do, is shoot somebody. That's the last resort. That's only when your life, the life of your partner, or the life of somebody is in imminent, danger. That is the last resort. Batman had all of these different things on his utility belt. Pepper spray, you got an axe, you got a baton, you have all of these things, at your disposal. And I get the argument of, we'll tell that to the bad guy, with a gun. But once again, if there's somebody with a gun, now we're in that territory of imminent danger to you, your partner, or somebody else. And then even then, there are protocols that you have to go through, because once again, once the bullet leaves the chamber, you can't call it back. You better be sure.
Yes, I just want to draw attention to two terrific comments. Robert Disney pointed out that, yes, certain stories call for gun violence, but the point is not to lean on gun violence as an easy tension builder, right, which as I alluded to, I think we've all probably been guilty of. And well, here's an act break, somebody pulls out a gun, and cut to commercial. And then Rachel Fisher, going off of what David was just saying, maybe the hero of the story is the one who doesn't fire their weapon, not the one who does, which is a really nice observation. We have really just one more minute, and unless there's any last questions from the audience, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank each of you for taking your time to participate tonight. I know everyone's time is very precious, and I love the diversity of perspectives, and hopefully this was helpful, as I said, to offer some opportunities in storytelling that perhaps we aren't taking advantage of. Brian, I thought when you said, you know what, we need to tell the whole story, not just the middle, but the beginning and the end. I thought that was a wonderful summation of the kind of opportunities that we've all been talking about tonight. Any last thoughts? We have like a couple of minutes if there's any summations. We've covered all the ground. I know.
We solved all the problems tonight, Ken.
All the whole issue.
Well, work's done here.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much. And thank you, Kris Brown and the Brady organization and Juano for joining these terrific writers, J. David Shanks and Dawn Prestwich and Nicole Yorkin and Brian Anthony. I just want to acknowledge again the Writers Guild Education Committee and our invaluable Writers Guild staff member, Greg Mitchell, who's so terrific with all of this, and our committee chair, Brian Gary. And just wanted to say thank you again to everyone, and let's all be safe.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
You guys. Bye-bye.